And we are recording. So, hello everybody. Thank you for joining to Phi Alpha Theta's first episode of Interviews with Historians. I have the pleasure here of interviewing Mr. Jesse Alexander. He is a historian currently stationed in Vienna, um, to which he actually got his master's degree with distinction from the University of Vienna. In his most recent work, he is a host, lead writer, and researcher for Real Time History, where they publish documentaries on military history. And the most recent one that most extensive one he's actually done was the Franco-Prussian War, which is a 6-hour documentary. It's a phenomenal documentary. I watched it on my travels to Alaska and back, and they also published a companion book, Glory and Defeat. It's a week by week case study, and it's very interesting for those of you that are interested in Prussian history and also 19th century European history. So, Mr. Alexander, would you mind, giving us an idea of what got you into studying history?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. And of course, I want to point out that 6-hour series, documentary series, is not me alone. Right? We worked with some other historians in Germany, and we have a whole team of editors and assistant researchers and all that kind of thing. But that said, I think what got me into history was curiosity as a kid and the family environment. I think those were two kind of important things. I grew up in the countryside in Canada in the pre-internet age. I guess I'm dating myself. There's no real way around that with what my hairline is doing. So basically, one of my main forms of entertainment when I was a kid was reading, because there was TV with the rabbit ear antenna, right? And there were books. And so I read books, I read old books, I read books that now I realize have no real historical value to explain history, but they had facts and they had information. And that's what I was interested in kind of soaking up as a curious kid. We had a hand-me-down set of World Book encyclopedias from 1961, which were already old by the time I got my hands on them. So just so your audience knows, I'm not ancient. And I read just a ton of articles in that encyclopedia. And I guess I always had extended family around, so I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they placed a lot of value on family stories and knowing the things that my great-grandparents had done and their parents and who they were and where they came from when they immigrated from Europe to Canada and all that kind of stuff. So these kind of stories were always being told, and everybody knew them, and they were repeated. And my grandfather was also a veteran of World War II in the Canadian Army. He landed in Normandy and fought across France, Belgium, and Holland, and then Germany. And so that was, as a young boy, this was super interesting to me. And we watched documentaries together and we talked about it, and I asked him questions. I asked him a lot of questions he couldn't answer because, I mean, he was a regular guy, right? Not a historian, but this, I think, played an important role. And he was also a self-taught kind of guy. He never went to university, but he had a bookshelf full of books. And many of them, of course, were about the war, because he wanted to understand a bit more about this momentous event that he'd been a part of and that affected him, and that traumatized him, of course. And so when I spent time at my grandparents', I was reading books and reading a lot of books about the history of war. And I think those are kind of the factors that came together and got me interested really from a very young age in history, and I guess in the history of warfare in particular.
Yeah, and it's so interesting too, because in university, when we study history, we focus primarily on everything but military history. And I find that pretty remarkable because, I mean, as when you study military history and study battles, there are battles throughout history that have decided cultures for regions. And so I think it's very interesting when we talk about military history, or we even talk about battles, it's not necessarily brushed over, but it's definitely briefly mentioned, and it's more focused on outcomes rather than, or even when you look at the actual battle itself, well, what happened to make this battle work and make them win, And I find that so interesting, especially, and there's probably a lot of us that have that same type of background where we get exposure from family and we get this curiosity and here you are, in Vienna, all the way across the ocean. So I think
Yeah.
that's so cool, and especially as as students of history, it's like this never-ending hunger for more, and that's something that's so cool. So I kind of want to dive into a little bit on real-time history and
Mhm.
as far as what a lot of historians publish works. It's either articles, books. What made you want to shift over to the digital side of things?
Well, it wasn't all planned. Let me put it that way. Things happen in life. You don't always plan everything out. I certainly didn't plan out my career the way that it has gone. But when I started my first attempt at a master's degree, which ended without me having a master's degree, right? I broke off that first master's study in Canada, study program in Canada. I realized then that I still had the passion for history. I wanted to, be involved in history and hopefully do as much with history as I could in my career. But I didn't really want to go to the PhD route of, publishing original research all the time, sitting in the archives all the time. That can be interesting, and I've sat in archives for a long time doing, paid research as a public historian, but also for my own master's thesis, which I eventually did complete here in Vienna. So I realized that the academic route was not necessarily the route that I wanted to take. The good thing is, contrary to what a lot of people believe, or maybe what some of your viewers' parents have told them, there are jobs in history out there. I'm not saying they're legion. It's not like computer programming or something, but there is a market for culture and for public history products like documentaries, like museum exhibitions, all that sort of thing. So initially, I had no thought of going into making history documentaries. I worked as a researcher back in Ottawa, in Canada, and I worked for several different museums. Then I worked for museums in different contexts, like organizing events and helping with exhibition creation and research for the exhibition panels, both pictures and writing texts and that sort of thing. And I was a tour guide as well for a long time when I was a student at different historic sites and different museums. But then I decided to come to Europe. And first I moved to Germany, then eventually to Austria. And I didn't know the language that well. I didn't have a lot of connections. I had a BA in history at that time and an unfinished master's, which can be, in some cases, a bit of a liability if you haven't achieved a master's degree. Not always, but it depends. And so I totally switched gears. I went away from history as a part of my way to earn my living. And I kept it as a hobby. I started a blog and I kept reading books, and I started reading history books in German once I learned German. Then I went back to finish this master's degree at the University of Vienna, but my work was not about history. And eventually I decided I wanted to make the leap and kind of go back. So I quit my office job. And then I decided, well, I need to reset. And somehow I wanted to be history. And so I applied all over the place to all sorts of different things. And lo and behold, I also saw that the Great War YouTube channel had been taken over by a new startup, Real Time History, based in Berlin, and that they were looking for a new host for the show. So I with the help of my former assistant at the university, a student there in media, we made like a pitch video saying, hey, this is me, and I really like history, and I've got some experience, and now I have a master's degree also, and I speak English and French and German fluently, which is pretty useful if you're talking about the First World War. Mm-hmm. And that's how it began. And first they took me on part-time because they're a startup. We were doing limited stuff. Then they expanded. We've done other full-length documentaries that are not available on YouTube. that are available on the Nebula streaming service, for example. And then we also opened up a second YouTube history channel called Real Time History, in addition to the Great War. And now this is what I do. So that's kind of the story of how it ended up where it is today.
That's cool. And I like how you mentioned that there's different avenues for those of us that are history enthusiasts, especially in the public sector. And it's funny because just yesterday, it was Super Bowl for us here in the States, which is like, it's like the World Cup for Americans. And I had a family friend ask me because she didn't remember what I studied, and instantly the go-to was, "Oh, so you want to become a teacher?" And that's this
always
super common understanding of history teaching. There's nothing else. So it's definitely interesting to see, and I think that it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do the interview with you is you branched down this whole different way in a growing digital world. Everything's become digital now, even primary sources, and the Times London is an example of everything moving towards the digital age. So there's definitely a market for it, and there's a hunger for it. I mean, I'm an example. I mean, if I'm at work and I have free time during my lunches, I watch documentaries, and it's so interesting. And even when I mentioned the 6-hour documentary, 6 hours, I told one professor, and they looked at me baffled. But even that, I mean, even to your credit, it wasn't boring. It was a good mixture of that historical knowledge, what's going on, the context, and also with the different transitions between animations and the field battle view. And it's so interesting to see how as students of history, we're adapting. We adapt to modern times with also being able to talk history and not make it boring. And there's so many different avenues outside of teaching. It's not the dreaded we have to be teachers.
I mean, even I was bored in history class in high school. So I remember, bless her soul, she was a very nice lady. I won't name names, but I remember one year in particular, we had Canadian history, of course, history of Canada and Quebec. And this teacher's method was to write out notes on the board, long sentences in cursive handwriting and chalk on the board, and just fill the whole board with these notes. And our job was to copy them down in class and then regurgitate the most important bits on the exam. And I liked the idea of absorbing information, but I was bored stiff. So yeah, it's unfortunately, history gets a bad rap, I think, in many ways, right? People think there's no jobs other than teaching, and people think it's a boring collection of facts that you have to memorize, like dates and all that sort of thing. But hopefully, with our work, we can kind of, people who are interested or even a little bit interested, even if they think, oh, maybe I'm just interested in learning some new facts, hopefully we can create our documentaries in such a way that they then kind of get access to a much broader view of history, that military history isn't just about battles and generals, it's about how society works with conflict and how it affects civilians. And then there are debates amongst historians, and history is not, set in stone. Revisionist is not some terrible, awful concept that's trying to start some woke revolution. I mean, ideas get revised over time. Sometimes you can associate those new interpretations with the left on the political spectrum. Sometimes you can associate them with the right on the political spectrum. Sometimes they're not all that political at all. And so we try to build in all these different elements and make it visually appealing, of course, and have a suitable, I hope anyway, energy level that keeps people kind of being interested and keeps people tuning in. For anybody who's not familiar, not all of our documentaries are 6 hours long, just so you can start it with more bite-sized gulps of anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes, for example.
Yeah, 6 hours, it is definitely a trek to do. But like I said, I watched mine on a plane when I was going on vacation to Alaska. Is 4 hour flight there and back, so I thought might as well just half and half. But it's so true, like you mentioned, that history is not static, and there's definitely different avenues to approach or to even to perceive it. Referring back to the documentary on the Franco-Prussian War, when you talked about the siege of Paris, it was so interesting how you guys noted that even within the city, the wealthy were able to access food, even to exotic meats when they started eating. It sounds almost crazy, and something we didn't learn in when I took that time period, 19th century history, and we didn't discuss that part of the Franco-Prussian War. But it's interesting how when you guys touched on that, it speaks to a broader volume of access, even after the revolutions in France, where it was more pushing for more equality amongst the socioeconomic barriers, that even in that moment, the rich, or the rich, so to speak, but they still had access to food that people without money, or who were a little bit impoverished at the time due to the siege, didn't. And it's so interesting, to include that in there, because it may seem like, well, what does this have to do with the broader scale of the war? But it's so important. Little details like that matter, and it gives deeper context. Yeah,
Yeah, and I like to think that we are keeping up with advances in the study of history. At least I would look at it as an advance to consider war in its full context, not only the fighting. Right? This is kind of the new military history, which isn't that new anymore. It's been going on for decades, but this is, to me, critical to understanding the war, whether you're an academic professional historian writing a general history of a war, or you're someone sitting at home who's interested in, hey, these are dramatic events when people are fighting each other. I want to learn more about whichever conflict it might be that the algorithm of YouTube suggests to you in your suggested screen, that they also come away with some kind of idea of not necessarily the complete totality, but the breadth of human experience in war. And I think it's one of the things we try to go for.
Oh yeah, and you guys definitely do a good job. I mean, I've watched them all so far, and I'm lucky to have a job where I do have some downtime to poke around in it. So I did want to ask, because I'm very curious, and I'm sure others are curious too. What made you go from Canada and Ottawa all the way to across the pond to Vienna?
Sometimes I'm not 100% sure, but it was a question of wanderlust, I think. I spent a lot of hours as a kid in these books, in this world of books, that most of what I was interested in was happening in Europe. At the trenches of the First World War, or the beaches of Normandy, or the Eastern Front, or whatever. It's all over there. And this, to me, was like such an interesting part of my life that I decided that I wanted to go and spend some time in Europe and see the places where all this history happened that I'd kind of been living through books previously. So I did come twice and lived in France twice briefly for student jobs as a student tour guide at historic sites, war sites from the First World War. And then I went back and said, I gotta find a way to spend more time in Europe again. So I saved up, worked for several years, and then Canada had some working holiday visa programs with different European countries, and I chose Germany because I wanted to learn German, and I thought that would be pretty useful as well for any future history career. And it turns out it was pretty critical.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's something that I've kind of ran into as well, is almost learning another language in historical study is not a requirement, but I mean, it opens access to a lot of different things. I mean, if we're talking primary sources or even secondary sources, when you're talking about the Franco-Prussian War, you want to read works that are by historians within both countries that know the culture, that have more access, I guess you could say. So learning, when you learn French and German, did you find yourself having access to more works, as far as whether it's primary sources or secondary sources?
Oh, absolutely. It's not comparable. it is another world to be able to access primary sources, yes, sometimes when necessary, and we've used both French and German primary sources, fairly extensively throughout our work. But the basis of our work, of course, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel and do our own original scientific scholarly research. That's not what these documentaries are about. So we rely primarily on secondary sources, on literature that's been published by other historians who have done the work in the archives, right? Who we feel are reputable. And what you can access, especially if you're looking at that particular conflict, right? Well, one country, German speaking, and the other one, or one state, one alliance of states, if I want to get specific here with the Prussians and the other German states, German's the language and the other is French. Now you can find some good books about the Franco-Prussian War in English, but you can find a lot more material and a lot more depth on individual experiences, on certain aspects of the conflict in French and German. And that is definitely what we used for that series. Again, not only me, and in this case, not primarily me, but primarily our partners at a German university, who even ordered up a 19th century publication from the Prussian General Staff with the statistics about every battle and how many horses and all this, so we could draw on that when needed. And I remember there were some obscure, semi-obscure, from the Anglo world point of view, issues like the siege of Strasbourg, or there were a couple of others as well, where I said, we don't quite have enough about this. Like, I want a paragraph about that. I think it's a significant thing. It's all there in French, but good luck trying to find that in English in any way, shape, or form. So you could get the main lines. We could have done the series just using English language literature, but it would nowhere near have been as rich or as varied or as in-depth as we tried to make it.
Yeah, definitely. And even in that documentary, specifically talking about that one, how there are moments when you were reading from either letters or some sort of correspondence, and then you would, whoever it was, you would even read it in French or German, and it definitely brings a more what's the word I want to look for? It's more of this this personal feel, this personal touch. It captures that.
I mean, I feel like this is a bit of a trick of the trade in a way, right? Because we don't convey more information. It's the lines that I spoke in French and German for some of the quotes are just a snippet of the rest of the quote that we read in English. So that I read in English. So it's not like there's extra material, but we wanted to bring across that feeling, right? Create that impression that you, the viewer, are a bit closer to the original person who's speaking, because they were writing or speaking in French or German at the time. And now this is a bit of a trick on our part. We want to use all the skills and resources that our team brings to the table. And sometimes that means if Tony, for example, learns a new skill with a graphics video, we put that graphic in. If I can read a line of text in French or German with a pretty good accent, then we put that on the table. YouTube is a competitive environment for history documentaries, and we want to have as many unique skills that we can show and that bring something to the viewers as possible. So it is a bit of a humble brag, I guess, in a way, to show, hey, we can do this, and not everybody does or can.
Yeah.
And I think this is a bit of a trick from a filmmaker point of view. I think we can create a feeling of more authenticity a little bit with that, even though there can be a historian who only speaks English, who knows more than me about the Franco-Prussian War, who couldn't read out those little snippets in English or French, in French or German. But that skill, that performance skill on my part, allows us to kind of create the the feeling of enhanced authenticity. Now, in our case, we feel we can back that up with what we do, but it is also part of the performance of posting the documentary. So yeah, it's a mixture of things, but it's definitely important.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I remember watching, I mean, in the moments where it came up, I only speak English, so I heard I'm like, oh, I don't know what he said, but I like it. Yeah, it's so cool. So I want to shift
Some
gears
people
a little.
liked it, some people liked it, and it annoyed some people, mostly English speakers who are not used to hearing foreign languages. No one other than English speakers complained about it. It's because, every speaker of another language is used to hearing English or other languages, regional languages, and we in the Anglosphere are a little bit less. But yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. So I do want to shift gears a little bit. So in the video, you had basically set out a preview of what's to come in 23 and the different areas you want to touch, and a lot of it's going to be focusing on the Great War. And one of the wars that you're going to be touching on is the Crimean War in 1853. So of course, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a hot topic, that specific war, but of course the region.
The Crimea sure is.
Yeah, well, currently in this whole situation, and I kind of wanted to dissect that a little bit as far as historical context when we talk about Russia and we talk about Ukraine and Crimea. For a lot of people, that don't know Crimea, when after the Cold War and everything broke off, Crimea was a part of Ukraine, and then Russia annexed it in 2014. So when writing about that war, was there any sort of hindrance in regards to accessing any documentation on the Russian side?
Not really, because as I say, we didn't go and say to ourselves, we're going to try to get Russian archival documents for this. We relied on good, or what we judged as good secondary sources. And most of them for that episode, we didn't use that much Russian literature. For other documentaries involving Russian topics, we've used a ton. We have a partner. Well, we have a historian partner who used to live in Russia, but since recent events had to leave Russia. So now she operates from somewhere outside of Russia. I don't want to put her in any difficult situation, so I won't mention her name or her exact location, but yeah, she helps us a lot, and we use reliable secondary literature in Russian regularly. One of the advantages in the Russian world is that copyright is not so strictly enforced. So you can find PDF copies of entire books fairly easily online in Russian. Not that I would encourage anyone to break copyright out there, but what can I say? And so for the Crimean War, what was tricky for us was trying to give a balanced flavor of the participation of the Ottoman Empire. Because the Ottomans are kind of the forgotten semi-great power, or power, let's say. They weren't really a great power at that time. And they're usually neglected in the literature in Russian, in French, and in English. Because of course, France plays a key role in this conflict, right? They have many more soldiers fighting in the Crimea than the British do, for example. And for that, we're lucky because there was a new, fairly comprehensive history that came out in an English translation by a Turkish historian. So we were able to make it work. There have been many other times when I've had to delve into our community and say, hey, I desperately want to give a balanced representation of the Turkish side of the Balkan Wars, but I'm missing a quote from, let's say, Mustafa Kemal, who later is, the most famous Turkish historical figure in modern history. But I know he was there. I see references to him, but I don't actually have a good quote from something that he wrote about it himself. And then people will send me something, and say, okay, here's the book in Turkish and here's the page I took it from. And we have some viewers who are quite reliable and who have studied history. Some of them are historians themselves, or some of them are graduate students. So that's how we try to resolve some of those problems. In general, though, to get back to your initial question, Russia has restricted access to its archives for outside researchers for quite some time now. It's not just something that occurred from 2022 or from 2014 started to happen a bit before that. There was this great window of time for about 20 years where anybody from the world could go and research Russian and Soviet history relatively easily with good access in the archives. But that era is over and it's done. And so there are some aspects of Russian history that won't be able to be explored in their full extent until some point in the future, hopefully, when those archives open up. For us, that's not the end of the world, because we rely primarily on secondary literature, and Russian language secondary literature is still widely available online.
Oh yeah, I mean that's good to know, especially when when you're working in that capacity. And so looking at that, I mean, so from the Crimean War, when it broke out in some of the Western perspective from the great powers, was that offset of balance. If Russia took the Crimean Peninsula, they have access to the Black Sea. From there, they could venture out in the Mediterranean. So for the Western powers to see this and say, let's keep Russia landlocked, so to speak, do you think that when looking in the grand scheme of history, that this is something that's kind of not the direct cause, but more so played out in the Russian mood of either expansion or feeling this sort of desire to gain more land and to be a part of the greater world stage?
Well, now that the short answer is that depends, right? Because Russia and the various states, Soviet Union, Russian Empire, Muscovy before that, I would say that the connection of the current Russian state going back in time probably makes sense to stop it at Muscovy and not go all the way back to Kievan Rus. And that is a connection that's made later by Russians, Russian historians, Russian leaders. That's not an interpretation that flies very well in Russia these days, but nonetheless, I think there are historical grounds for that division. But in any case, various Russian states have been different over time, and their relationship with other European states has also been different at different times, right? So I think we'd be sort of oversimplifying to say that, there's a constant conflict without any change or without any interruption, and a constant desire of Russia to expand without end, et cetera, et cetera. I think that ebbs and flows over time, depending on the circumstances. Right now, unfortunately, Russia has developed in a way where the national politics, both domestic and then foreign policy, are based primarily on a revanchist kind of desire to restore what they see as imperial grandeur, and at the cost of what they see as inferior states or illegitimate states or illegitimate national identities that don't deserve to exist or that shouldn't exist. And this is an extremely dangerous, obviously, cocktail. It's a deadly cocktail that's getting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and hundreds of thousands of Russians killed as we speak, unfortunately. So, there are times when Russia had alliances with European countries. There are times when Russia freed European countries from underneath the control of other European countries, like take the Napoleonic Wars. Austria and Prussia were fairly happy that the Russian army was marching into Central Europe to fight against Napoleon, who had before then, been dominating them and forced concessions and defeated them. So, I don't think it's too easy to fall into a constant antagonism. Obviously, there have been many periods of antagonism, and unfortunately, they have been ongoing since 1917, with the brief exception of perhaps 10, 15, maybe 20 years, but I'm going to say no. Let's say for 13 years or so, from 1991 until before 2014, right? if you want to be generous. You could extend that a bit maybe into the Gorbachev era, or you could say, well, maybe it stopped when Putin started to describe his imperial desires in about 2007-8 or so. But yeah, there's this brief window. And I think our thinking is very much colored by that century of conflict, as it should be. I mean, it makes sense, it's a century, it's a long time.
Yeah.
But in the very grand scheme of things, it doesn't have to be that way. Unfortunately, it's definitely that way now because Russia has invaded a neighbor and is attempting to conquer it and attempting to wipe out its language and culture. So this is going to have an impact. There's going to still be an antagonistic relationship with Russia for some time. We'll see for how long, because that kind of depends on what happens with Russia, what happens with this war, if the regime stays the same way, or if another regime bases its legitimacy on the same ideas of this desire for imperial revenge on its neighbors. And who can say, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's something I think as us students of history, when we look at this, there's so much speculation, right? We could say, well, there's some sort of general mood from the past and how that connects to now. And like you mentioned, regime change can not necessarily be an instant, but I mean, within a decade, things can change.
I think what's really key is how we understand the past. As much as things that happened in the past that have an influence, you know, the Russian government makes a choice to look at history in the way that it does. It could look at history in a different way. It could choose to look at the fall of the Soviet Union differently. It could choose to look at the historical relationship between the Russian state and its neighbors in a different way. It could choose to look at the history of the Crimean Peninsula in a different way, but it doesn't. It makes this choice to use history as a part of this agenda of imperial conquest, basically. And so yeah, that's how we end up where we are.
Yeah, and here we are. And even so, then looking at Ukraine, I know one of the organizations you worked with is called Ukraine, so like YOU and then KRAINE. Would you mind explaining that a little bit more as far as what it's about and what its aims?
Sure. I mean, of course, you know, I work as a public historian, but I'm also a human being. I'm also a citizen of Canada. I'm a resident of the European Union. I care about what's happening in Ukraine on a human and on like a moral and ethical level. It's not just a war that is interesting to me because I'm interested in human conflict, right? Like intellectually. So I wanted to get involved when the war began, and there's a team of Ukrainians who live in Vienna who created this small NGO called Ukraine. And they specialize in sending humanitarian aid directly to partners that they know in Ukraine. So it's not like a big bureaucratic international thing. They send medium-sized transportation vans full of stuff that they buy with donations or that are donated to them. There are some medical supply companies and things, for example, that donate them equipment, surgical equipment, protective equipment, bandages, casts, wheelchairs, you name it. Things to keep people warm as well throughout the winter, generators, whole ambulances they buy with donations and send them so they can be used then to evacuate people from the front more quickly. Yeah. So this is their focus, and they send shipments regularly. They partner up with a couple of other grassroots NGOs in Vienna to make sure the van is full, to make sure it's going to the right place and so on. So I've been volunteering with them. Sometimes I'm loading trucks or unloading trucks at their little warehouse. Sometimes I'm trying to spread the word about them so people know out there, like today, like your viewers out there. If ever they want to donate, they can find the website. Hopefully we can put a link up below this video. And I also try to help as much as I can. One of the ambulances, I sort of led the fundraising drive for that ambulance, which thankfully worked out. And then I drove the ambulance to Ukraine and delivered it, I should say, to the Ukrainian medical services there. That was the same weekend of the first mass missile attack in October. So I got to experience war much more closely than I have before, sitting in a bomb shelter while missiles are exploding somewhere out there on the surface.
Jeez.
And I mentioned that just because I think it's easy for us to feel the war is farther away than it really is, right? This war is crucial for the security of Europe and of North America and of the safety of democratic systems, which are facing all sorts of other challenges as well. But now this is a very serious one coming from the outside, right? And not only Russia, but of course China is involved in this new situation, a challenge to the influence of democracies in the world and in Europe in particular. So I want to, my experience being involved in this charity group, driving to Ukraine, being under fire, I guess you could say, although it's not like being at the front line by any means. I tell the story because I want people to feel that, hey, somebody I maybe saw on YouTube or someone who I'm watching speaking now was there, experienced some of that. And this is the experience of tens of millions of Ukrainians every day. So I went there for a weekend to donate a charity ambulance. There were some bombs, and then I left. But they're there. It's their life. It's their homeland. And they are exposed to much worse than that for a year now. So I think we can't let that out of our minds. And of course, we all have our own concerns and difficulties in our lives. But for those of us who are able to help, I think it's pretty important for our civic duty that we do.
Oh, definitely. And even a dollar helps. I mean, it may not seem like it doesn't help, but that dollar amongst many dollars builds up to something, greater. And it's definitely important too, especially when we, as students of history, it's not just military history, right? There's cultures, people. And like, you'd mentioned before, it's how does war affect people? And in any way, shape, or form. I mean, we also, even here in the States, we're so far away, and where I'm in Southern California, we may not think of how crucial a truckload of thick coats or winter blankets may be important. I mean, here in California, Southern California, most importantly, our coldest winter is 50 degrees, and we're on lockdown, and National Guards deployed with blankets and water. And
Crimea River. I'm from Canada, man.
Yeah, I have a friend in Canada, and we always make this joke with each other. But it's so important to remember that there are average everyday people that are affected by this, that by no fault of their own are trying to survive as a war goes on. And there was even a video I saw. It was a camera footage within a small kiosk, and it was a girl, and she was selling coffee. And there was a man, and I believe it was either his wife or somebody else was waiting for coffee, and you hear in the video the incoming rocket, and it explodes maybe a block down. The whole room shakes, and that's a reality for them. And like you had mentioned, you were there for briefly, and you were back home, or even us here in the States, we watched this video, and we're so detached from it. And those people can't necessarily just pick up and go. That's their home. So it's so important to dive in and donate into these organizations that are not, like you had mentioned, in this weird kind of age of skepticism, where we know our money is going to go for the right cause. We know, there's a child out there that needs water, blankets, or even a toy.
It's direct aid. I mean, people have decided, instead of donating money, they would online order, for example, a generator and have it delivered to the charity. And then the charity takes the generator. So it's a donation of goods rather than money. And that's also a possibility. And I think, as much as I hope that it's a human motivation, that we feel empathy for the people who are suffering for no reason in Ukraine, for no fault of their own, right? But it's bigger than that too, because it's about our long-term quality of life and safety and security as well. Europe and the United States and Canada are less safe and secure, and we will have a much more uncertain future, potentially a less prosperous future, if Russia wins this war and conquers a part of, or heaven forbid, all of Ukraine. The potential ramifications are very, very serious for all of our quality of life as well. And so I think that's something that I also hope that people keep in mind.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I'll definitely put a link down on our videos.
Appreciate that.
Those that are interested to donate, of course, remember every dollar counts, even if it's a penny. A penny builds up to something greater. And yeah, I mean, it's important for the grand scheme of things and the greater scheme of things, especially when decades from now, when if some of us become, published historians, and we look to studying this war and the effects and all the different angles, whether it's humanitarian aid, how it changed the war, or even military aid, it's definitely important for all of us. It's especially how interconnected we are.
And for our own consciences, right? What did you do when this tragedy was occurring, when this threat to our way of life basically was kind of thrown down by Russia, unfortunately?
Yeah, definitely. So guys, go donate. So I want to conclude with just a very simple question. As somebody who studied history, got their bachelor's, going back to the origin story of Mr. Alexander, and moving to Vienna, what advice would you have for students that aren't necessarily sure with if they want to do teaching, get their master's, or even their PhD? And what advice would you have as someone who's developed a successful career out of it?
Well, I would say first thing is, don't get yourself into a box, right? Don't think that there's only one path with history. Don't think that there's only one timeline for you and a history career. Like, people do go and work for a couple of years, then go back and do a master's. People do take 10 years to finish their PhD sometimes, if that's the way that their path takes them. I would also say that trying to rush, this is connected to the timeline question, I guess, trying to rush into a preordained kind of series of steps towards your goal is not necessarily the way that you can achieve it. There are many other different ways. You might, for example, study abroad or spend a year working on a working holiday visa where you don't directly do history work, but you learn a foreign language. And then lo and behold, that is a language that's useful for when you go back and do your master's, or for when you're applying for some public history related job. I mean, think in the US, especially, think of the advantages if you speak Spanish, right? If you're dealing with the public at a museum or tours of a historic site, you have Spanish and English, and the next applicant doesn't, it's a huge advantage to you. And not only that, but even if you learn French, think of all the documents you might want to look at when you're doing your research about the Louisiana Purchase, about the French and Indian War, as you call it, the 7 Years' War for the rest of the world. These are extremely, or Dutch, if you're interested in the early colonial history of New York, right? This is a key thing. And you can't go back in your 50s when you're saving for retirement and you have a couple kids. Maybe you can, but it's much harder then to try to learn language. It's better. It's never too late, but take advantage of the freedom at the earlier part of your career to weave that in, because it's going to give you way, way more opportunities in your career afterwards. And it also enriches your personal life. Of course, I've made all sorts of friends and had all sorts of experiences and seen movies and read books and had interesting conversations while traveling because I've tried to learn some languages. My Russian is not fluent, but it's not that bad. And I really feel like I got a better sense. I had a much richer experience traveling in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, because I could communicate with people up to a certain level. So I would say no rigid timelines, no rigid objective. It's okay if you have a clear goal that you want, but be aware that there could be other opportunities as well in case something comes up that you haven't planned on. And languages. All about languages, man. It's not the only thing, so don't give up if you only speak English. Obviously, there are many, many things you can do, but that is a nice wrinkle to add in as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time. Definitely appreciate it. It's so interesting to have an interview with the historian that's not only just, was born and raised in a different country, but who's traveled abroad and who's seen the world and has studied history in all these different angles and different areas. So on behalf of Cal Pi Pomona and Phi Alpha Theta, we thank you greatly for the time, and we look forward to possibly doing it again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I think you have a great rest of your day.
You too.